Okay, well, welcome everybody to Friends, Food, and Faith in this 4th of July edition, I guess. So I thought it might be good as we get ready to celebrate our nation's independence to maybe look at this understanding, at least the church's perspective of what we call church and state and what that actually means. You know, it's interesting that in our politics, there seems to be this running theme where it says that, the church and state should be separated. And what's interesting is the church tends to agree with that. But actually, you won't find that in the Declaration of Independence. You won't find that in our Constitution. What that comes from is a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson to a Methodist congregation who was asking about the government starting to kind of get involved with their own running of their own church. And what Thomas Jefferson was trying to allay to these people is that no, the state has no authority to actually get involved with the church, and nor should the church have that authority to get involved with the church. And there's a separation, there's a wall between the church and state, so the state can't be involved in the runnings of the church. Over time, that's kind of been taken on different understanding, right? And so it's important to understand these foundations, and also maybe interesting to know what the church teaches about these things. So I'd like to start, as we probably should do, with Scripture. So let's just start in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So this comes from the letter 2 John, verses 7 through 11. Many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh, such as the deceitful one and the Antichrist. Look to yourselves that you do not lose what we worked for but may receive a full recompense. Anyone who is so progressive as not to remain in the teaching of the Christ does not have God. Whoever remains in the teaching has the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him in your house or even greet him. For whoever greets him shares in his evil works. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. So that's it can be somewhat of a very difficult passage to read, right? Because, it talks about being progressive. And I think we have to understand in the context of this what that actually means, right? So we often find in our society we have conservatives and progressives and liberals and whatever. And so what John is really saying there is that we can't get out over our skis. So in other words, to be progressive for progressive's sake is not helpful. We have to do that in line with what the deposit of faith gives us. In other words, we should be guided by our faith to make determinations for ourselves, for society, for countries, for cultures. That needs to be guided by this faith. And so if we're so progressive that, we're past, these teachings that are sort of antiquated and, they really may be good for a time, but these days we don't really need them anymore. That's a big problem. And that's going to come up a little bit later in our discussion. So stay tuned for that. First, maybe it's important to look at some of the church history, so how this kind of came about. So what's interesting, the church has always actually taught that there should be a separation for church and state. That in reality, the church really shouldn't have any governance when it comes to secular matters, right? Now, that hasn't really happened in practice over time. We can talk about those circumstances as we go forward. But in general, that's what the church has really taught, is that, priests and bishops and laymen, they are for a particular purpose. They have a swim lane, so to speak, right? And they should stay in that swim lane. And that's an important swim lane, and it maybe has some impact on everything else that we see in the secular world, at least maybe it should. But priests, bishops, popes, deacons, should not be making secular decisions. So what does that maybe look like? Well, okay, maybe a pope or a bishop shouldn't make a determination on what kind of taxes that they should put on people to build roads and courthouses and schools. Maybe that's not something a bishop should do. Maybe a bishop should not levy a tariff on another country, right, for imported goods, right? Maybe the bishop should not be setting maybe the speed limit for a particular community, right? These are kind of secular things. They have a good purpose, right? So it's good to have, taxes to actually help build roads and build things that we need. Sure. It's good to have speed limits, right? So that we can actually all be on the same page and not, maybe kill each other on the roads. That's good. There's a morality that kind of comes from that. But how that morality is kind of maybe maintained, well, that can be an open question. and maybe bishops and priests and deacons shouldn't really have that call. They can give like the goal, right? Here's our moral, here's what we're trying to uphold. But we should leave it to people that are experts and actually kind of knowledgeable to actually make determinations, practically speaking, in these type of situations. So this kind of developed first off after the early church. So if we may recall, the apostles, they were not secular rulers, obviously, right? Many were martyred, right? They were really died for the faith. And many of their progeny, maybe their disciples also did the same thing for about 200 years or so. About the year 313, there was a great battle, the Battle of Milvengian Bridge. So this was a battle between Constantine, the current proconsul of Rome, and a warring sect of other Romans, right? They were kind of vying to actually take over Rome. Well, Constantine was outnumbered. And so he saw this great sign in the sky in the sun of this Greek rho and a Greek chi, right? And a cross. And so he was told by Jesus to put this on his banners, put the sign on his shields, and they would be victorious. So, of course, in hoc signo vincimus was also the title, in this sign we conquer. And so he put that on his banners and all his shields, and of course he won the day. So he attributed that to divine grace, that Jesus was the one that won the battle for him, which, true. And so from that point on, he was able to become the emperor. So 2 years. Okay. So after Constantine flew to Constantinople, this kind of set up these kind of rival factions. So he's kind of set up the empire in like 4 different parts, right? So they had these Augustuses and these what was the other ones? Proconsuls, right? So he had these kind of different ways of governing the empire. Now, the fact that there were still persecutions going on was still kind of happening, depending on who was actually ruling what areas. But Christianity was still the national religion. And of course, famously, we believe that Constantine converted to Christianity on his deathbed, right? He was baptized, probably at the prompting of his mother, Saint Helena, right? So, in the Eastern Church, he's kind of venerated as saint, but there's still been this separation in the Western Church, especially of like, well, you may be the emperor, you may be the Augustus, but really we're the church. We're going to run our own life. We have this person that's set up by God to be the vicar, to kind of run these things, and it's going to be his call with his brother bishops. That's how we're kind of governing the church. You can govern the empire any way you want, but just kind of leave us alone. And for the most part, that kind of happened. There was some kind of little bit of kind of disputes when it came to like, maybe different synods being called or different councils, and who's taking credit for that, whose job was to promulgate. Well, we'll see a lot of early writings where the emperors were taking credit for a lot of things promulgated from the church, but the thing is, they weren't, right? The emperor may have been there, but the emperor didn't have a vote. The emperor didn't actually have any say. The Pope was the one that actually promulgated, or he had a delegate maybe that would actually be there to actually receive back to the Pope what was going on, and the Pope would say yeah, yes, or no, and then that was what would happen, right? So a doctrine didn't become doctrine until the Pope promulgated it, and that happened all throughout history, right? Okay. So we get to about the 7th century, and what happens is Rome starts falling into kind of disarray. It gets kind of sacked by these Vandals, and then these Visigoths, and these all different barbarians, who were all Christian. But they were kind of subscribing to a Christianity called Arianism, right? So Arianism was a form of Christianity where it kind of didn't see the fullness of Christ as being God. It kind of looked at Jesus as being a created being, who was a perfect created being, and maybe even got to the point where they became God, but Jesus was not necessarily born God. It didn't exist before he had a body. So a lot of problems with that, right? So if it was just a man that freed us, then, well, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
That's a big issue. Over the next few councils, that kind of got fleshed out. But it was still kind of prevalent, especially because communications across the empire became kind of frizzled, right? So one of the great things about the Pax Romana, the great peace of Rome, was that they had all these roads and soldiers, and so messages you got very, very quickly and come back and give information very easy. It was like the internet except very slow. And so but for that time, that was super. It was like the internet. It's like, oh great, I have a message from Tort. Yeah, great. Okay, wonderful. What's going on? Oh, the Pope had a meeting. Oh, they had this. Great. So that was actually happening until there started the decline of the Roman Empire, where whether it be decadence, whether it be the decline of the army, communication started to break down. So what happened was you saw these barbarian hordes that were even converted by some great saints, like let's say even Christmas tree guy. Who's the Christmas tree guy?
Nicholas?
No.
Germany?
Yes. Wow, I can't believe we just had his feast day a few weeks ago. Anyway, so these great saints are going out, they're doing missionary work and they're evangelizing, but they're going so far to the edge of the empire, not necessarily going too far out. So you still have these other tribes and everyone who are maybe hearing of the word of Christianity, like secondhand or third hand, but they're not getting the fullness because that communication hasn't been going out to them from these decrees of the councils and everything else that, oh yeah, that Arianism stuff, we don't worry about that anymore. So Arianism even crept even into about the 7th or 8th century, right? Until it was finally defeated after really these Vandals and these barbarians came to Rome and sacked it so many times, they actually learned the faith. so in some ways it was kind of good, but in other ways it really caused a great vacuum out of the Roman Empire. And to this point, there was sort of a very clear divide between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. And the Western Empire was declining, right? So all the riches and the wealth was in Byzantium. It was actually in Constantinople. They had all these beautiful churches and palaces and everything else, and all the money was going there, and everything else was kind of falling apart. And so when Rome was finally sacked completely, caused a great vacuum of power. Because, well, now, these Goths and these Vandals kind of come in, then they go away, and there's no one in charge anymore. And that's not happening just in Rome, but that's happening all over the empire. Well, now what do we do? Well, usually in those circumstances, you look to what's the most stable thing. Well, what's the most stable thing we got?
Church.
The church. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you, Holy Father, and these bishops, this land. And it's yours. You can do whatever you want with it, right? And we'll even give you an army to protect it, these feudal lords, these owners of these areas. And that happened famously with Charlemagne, right? So Charlemagne was said to give a donation to the Holy See of a lot of lands in France, in Germany, and mostly in Italy. And so what that basically did was set up these bishops and these popes as being feudal lords, right? And so now they're landowners, and now they're getting taxes, and now they're doing these things which they didn't necessarily ask for, but they're also saying no either, right? So okay, well, great. Well, how is this kind of affecting church and state? Well, there is no real state because we're here. So then as time goes on, these more with Charlemagne and his progeny and other lords, they kind of started going their own kingdoms, and so there's sort of like kind of a setback. But these lands are still owned by the Holy Father, right? That hasn't been given off. No one's really taken them, and so it's like, okay, so he becomes very influential, and the church becomes very influential in the politics of these particular kingdoms, right? Because not only are you now, okay, you own land, but also, well, you have spiritual authority too, right? And you put those two together, usually bad things happen, right? So we get this all the way up to about 1054. So in 1054, we have a great split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, right? So Constantinople kind of sets themselves up as the new Rome, and they have very, very close allies with the Byzantine Emperor, right? To the point where whatever the Byzantine Emperor did, that's what the church was doing there, right? So there's a great blur there between this church and state, and the church and state were almost one, right? That was one of the causes of this great schism, was that, well, wait a minute, we have to keep the separation. Well, we don't want to. We're with the emperor. We're good. Oh, and by the way, you put this filioque in there and all this other stuff, and we don't, we're good. We're done, And that kind of started even early on. There's a lot of things like the iconoclasm schism, iconoclast heresy about destroying of sacred objects, and that was never promulgated by the church, but people were starting to do that, and that caused some problems. Again, communication was a big problem during this time because the roads were destroyed. There was no armies. There was problems going on. So 1054, we have this great split where you have the Eastern Church that kind of goes along with the Emperor, Constantinople. And then you still have the Western Church, which is like, well, we're trying to maintain the church state, but we're not doing a very good job of that, right? That kind of is the case all the way through the Renaissance, all the way up to about the 17th century, where you then start having the Great Reformation, right? So, or the 16th century when you have the Reformation. So you have a Protestant revolution that kind of causes a further schism in the church. And that is political too, in the fact that like Martin Luther really, well, first off, you have Henry VIII, who was a king himself and saw himself as the head of the church in England, which was problematic and also against the teaching of the church that church and state should be separate. And then you have Martin Luther, who was appealing a lot to the German princes to get his ideas off the ground and running. And depending on which era of Luther you're looking at, in some ways he's very much for the people, but later in his life he was very much on the side of the princes because, well, that's where the authority is and that's where the power is. Right? Then we flash forward about 200 years to the 18th century, and we have this new idea that kind of starts up in the eastern part of this new world called the America, of this understanding that why do we need a king, right? What is this? Why don't we just have a government that's governed by ideals and values and laws, and these also seem like they're rights given to us directly by God. Now, from a Catholic perspective, you're saying, sure, why not? That sounds like a good idea. I mean, as long as you're allowing the church to do what she does, what do we care, right? I mean, if you're going to have a government that doesn't have a king, well, we've had that before in the church, so what's the big deal, right? Go for it. So we have to look at some of the influence. So first, I think the first thing against that we have to look at this development was that it wasn't a Catholic movement, right? So you have a country for the first time really in a long, long time that came about not from a Catholic person or a practicing Catholic or even a nominal Catholic. It was kind of started by a Protestant or Protestant groupings, right? Now Catholics were there. Maryland was a colony that was set up as the first Catholic colony, and I think it was interesting in the early part of the United States, the Catholic population was actually relatively small. I think it was only about 5% of the population of the continental United States, or the colonies of the United States. But in the Revolutionary War, 25% of the army was Catholic. So I think it was kind of interesting. Maybe a lot of those Irishmen coming in, who knows? I don't know. But that's kind of a fascinating point. So at the founding of this new country that was made up of Catholics and Protestants, there was this kind of Protestant influence, which was sort of, at the time, looked on as kind of leery, right? Because like, well, okay, I mean, in general, it's good. Government is good, and have independence is good. But it's not using Catholic ideals, so to speak. So even early on, there was sort of like this sort of like ambiguity, but also sort of like a hands-off approach when it came to the part of the church about what the United States is. Although the Holy See did set up a bishop, Bishop Carroll is the first bishop of Baltimore, which was the first see in the United States, at least the continental, the 13 colonies. Before that, you had dioceses set up out of Mexico City,
in Florida.
Florida. You also had the French in Quebec. Actually, the Diocese of St. Louis predates the Diocese of Baltimore. I'm sorry, no, it does not. It's the third one in the that was put in the continental United States. Walla Walla, Washington, also was a diocese that came out of that. But so regardless, you already have this Catholic influence in the French and the Spanish in the western part of this country, but in the center, in the eastern part of this country, it's very at that point more Episcopalian, probably Methodist, more like kind of Anabaptist. So it was sort of a hodgepodge of different faiths. And rightly so, the church said, well, we need to get established there so we can actually start ministering to our people and starting the ministry of missionary work in that territory. About 100 years later, there was a great, not necessarily great heresy. Actually, it was the heresy that was thought to be never was. So this great heresy popped up that was called Americanism. So Leo the 12th was sort of wondering, like, kind of looking at the American landscape, and there was a biography that was written for a priest called Father Hecker, Isaac Hecker. So does anyone know who Father Isaac Hecker is? Okay. He's actually the founder of the Paulist Fathers. So his kind of ministry, and this is like the late 19th century, like I think he died in like 1880. But his kind of main thing was he was looking at like developments in communication to kind of start evangelizing, right? So, we have these things called like the telegraph. Why can't we use that to evangelize? We have publications. Why can't we start putting these out? And at the time, the Holy See was sort of like leery of like those kind of communications, because they were like, well, if anyone just puts out their opinion and they're not guided by faith, that seems to be a problem, right? So they weren't necessarily against the free press, but they were kind of leery of the free press. Be like, shouldn't these things be guided by some principles? Which in reality isn't a bad idea, right? But Father Hecker was kind of taking these things and running with them, and so I think what's funny is now Father Hecker is actually, I think, a servant of God. So there was some misunderstanding. Some people thought maybe the translation was a little wrong, but there was a preface that was done by an abbot over in France that was sort of taking these ideals to the extreme of that, this independence of the United States that is a kind of a shining light for the rest of the church, and especially maybe a shining light for Rome. Maybe how to actually do church is maybe look at the American church and see how they do it. Now, of course, the Holy Father would be kind of like, really? That's interesting. I don't remember putting a vicar of Christ over in the United States, so maybe we should look at that a little bit and determine what actually is going on. And there were certain things like, for instance, how the church kind of developed in the United States came from a French influence. So during the time of the founding United States, there was also a great revolution in France, right? The French Revolution, where many people died and were killed, especially those who were part of the church. So prelates and some of these religious, they actually found themselves to the Catholic faith. And they established seminaries and schools. And so during this, this time where there's this great transition from Europe into the New World, many priests and bishops and other people went with these people that they were ministering to this New World to establish these new churches and new places. Well, a lot of them were Irish, right? And so these Irish priests and bishops were being taught by these by these French priests and bishops, which had an idea of like maybe a little bit independence. So one of the things they kind of saw from the French Revolution was that the church was a little bit too strict. They needed to kind of let up a little bit on some of the teachings to kind of let the modern day world kind of come in and live for the day. Kind of let's look at what's going on now and kind of adapt now and kind of like maybe get rid of some of these teachings that are not necessarily in line with the spirit of modern society.
Sounds like today.
Yeah.
In addition to that, there was also this kind of understanding, or lack of understanding, I should say, about the role of bishops and the role of the Pope, right? So it's interesting that during this time, and many of those prelates were kind of looking at the episcopacy as like its own Pope. So in other words, like, hey, if you're a bishop, boy, you got a lot of autonomy. You got a lot of authority, right? You got a lot, and you're not really answerable to anybody, right? I mean, the Pope, he's 3,000 miles away in Rome. I mean, you're going to be in New York City or Chicago or whatever else. He's not going to know what you're going to be doing. And so maybe you shouldn't, because, hey, it's your place. You got to kind of take care of your own. So that was there's something in the water there from these teachings that came over with these immigrant societies and these priests and these bishops. And so you saw like an air of that in a lot of the episcopacy of the United States in that 19th century. And so Leo the 12th rightly was like, hey, I'm sorry, Leo the 13th. He was sort of like, we want to look at this a little bit. So he actually wrote a letter, encyclical, to Cardinal Gibbons, who was the Archbishop of Baltimore at the time. And this is called Testum Benevolentiae Nostrae. So test of our love.
I like that. Well put.
Yeah,
well
right,
put.
yeah, right.
Well
So So what he kind of outlined here was kind of these things that he saw from not only Father Hecker's biography, and I think that's been clarified a little bit. I think it was understood that what all he was really Father Hecker was trying to do is use the means of the day to kind of promulgate the gospel, right? And so that was misconstrued, and there's also maybe some translation issues. But what Pope Leo XIII kind of was looking at here was, yeah, okay, look, we have to first understand what the role of the bishop is, what the role of the church is, right? So again, it's this idea of freedom, this idea of independence is good, but it has to also be in line with what we understand freedom to be. And freedom truly is following the will of God. And so if we're not promulgating the gospel and fulfilling these truths are handed down to us by Christ himself, it's all going to fall apart. It's going to be meaningless, which means you can't just pick and choose what you want to believe and what you don't want to believe, right? Interesting.
All or nothing.
Right. So you're either Catholic, meaning you uphold and you believe and you preach everything the church teaches, or you're Catholic in name maybe, but you're not Catholic, right? So that's kind of first of all. Second, he really overcame, which was actually a problem, of congregationalism. So during this time, congregationalism. So what that was kind of like it's sort of a Protestant adaptation. So in other words, okay, it's not the bishop and the priest for my parish. We're going to get together and find a priest and pull him into our parish, right? And a lot of that could be dependent on okay, well, maybe it was because we're Polish and we need a priest that speaks Polish. So let's go back to Poland, find a priest and bring him back over. Or let's write to the bishop in Poland. That was happening quite often. And we see that in St. Louis. I mean, that's why we have one church every block. Because you had the German church, and you had the Irish church, and you had the Italian church, and whatever. We even kind of see that came about a little bit, in our modern time, and we'll talk about that in a second. So this congregationalism was kind of put to a stop and said we can't keep doing that. The bishop has autonomy to appoint and put these priests there, and they need to go. If a priest comes from another place, they need to go through that bishop to be put in a parish, right? So. Of course, we trust the bishop is going to do what's best for the people that are there, but ultimately the bishop needs to make that call, not the people in the pews, right? That actually had some effect because that's also why Bishop de Burgh came to St. Louis. So the people in New Orleans kind of rejected him, and they were looking to get a new bishop. And so in the meantime, he came to St. Louis, and he was never the bishop of St. Louis, but he established a home and a place here, even though because this is still within his diocese at the time. St. Louis was part of the New Orleans diocese, and so, but he was kind of the victim of congregationalism in New Orleans. So that was kind of put to a stop, right? That was kind of this is like late 19th century. The other thing that they really were trying to put a damper on and really uphold is kind of this understanding of the religious orders. That there was, at the time, there's sort of the religious orders weren't seen to be in line with what the modern man is really destined to be, right? It's we're taught to be kind of grow into rich abundance. At the time, the United States was in great abundance, and is even today. And so these orders weren't seen to be compatible with those. So they were kind of diminished in the eyes of a lot of the prelates in the early church. And what the Holy Father is telling them is no, look, that's a good thing to do, right? We want people to actually engage in these orders and live lives of obedience and temperance and charity and poverty and chastity. So we want to promote those and not try to dissuade those, right? And so finally, there was sort of this kind of overcoming of this level of thought of Protestant influence of the Catholic Church in the United States, right? So, in other words, we need to uphold the tradition of the Church, the teaching of the Church, and reject those that aren't in line with it, right? Now, what's kind of fascinating about all this is that this wasn't really known to many people at the time at all. It may have been given to a handful of bishops, and the bishops may have looked at it and said, okay, great. But what's kind of funny is a lot of things that the Holy Father is kind of saying, we should really look at these things and kind of move towards tradition in line with the church teaching. Almost the opposite kind of happened, right? I mean, so Kathy, you mentioned we talk about cafeteria Catholics, right, who kind of pick and choose who they want to believe. Yeah, that's still present today,
Mhm.
and it hasn't really been overcome, right? To make it even more exacerbated, in the 1920s, the first time ever in American politics, a Catholic politician was going to run for president. Do you know who that person was? Yeah. Al Smith. Al Smith was looked upon, he was going up against Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a staunch anti-Catholic, and Al Smith, to kind of make himself more appealable in a time where Catholicism was looked down upon as very shady, right? So the big issue that most people had with Catholicism in the 19th and 20th century was that, well, who's your allegiance to? If you're a papist, how can you claim allegiance to the United States if you're claiming allegiance to a pontiff who's 3,000 miles away? I think what time has shown is that you can be both, obviously, right? And that even the Catholic Church is upholding the ideals of the principles of the United States, that these ideas of freedom and independence and liberty, life, liberty, those are good things to do, right? Provided you know what they come from, and even in line with the founding fathers understood, that still requires a moral people to uphold those things, right? And the church is like, yeah, good. How those morals are obtained and where they come from, well, that's a question. But still, so it should be something that everyone upheld as if you call yourself Christian. Al Smith, though, ran for president, and he was defeated. He never actually held the office. But one thing that was kind of in the water that he instituted was, it was asked, well, how can you as a Catholic uphold, let's say if there's an issue that comes up that's against the teaching of the church, what would you do? Right? So what Al Smith, maybe politically, was very, very smart, but from a faith standpoint was incredibly detrimental. He said, well, I am Catholic, and when it comes to the needs of the people, I am also a public servant. So in other words, if there's a situation where the morals that I'm taught as a Catholic conflict with what the people want from a political standpoint, I'll do what the political standpoint wants me to do, which would also be wrong and also immoral and also a problem, right, from a Catholic standpoint. We saw that again come up when John F. Kennedy ran for president. He kind of echoed Al Smith and his approach, and in some ways we see that now with our current president, I think. But that really caused a great scandal, because, well, no, if the people want to elect you to that position, they're electing you because of the morals you uphold. And if they don't want those morals that you uphold, then they won't elect you. So in other words, is it more important for you to be a practicing Catholic or to be the president of the United States? Now, I think the church would say it's more important for you to be a practicing Catholic, right? Because that is not just about your soul. It's also about the souls you influence in those positions too, right? Because if you're in the position of a president and you make moral decisions, that impacts people incredibly. And especially if you make immoral decisions, that impacts them even further. Which I also think why we see today this kind of conflation between legalism and moralism, right? So you see a lot of people that say, well, it's legal, so therefore it must be moral. Well, no, that's not how that works, right?
Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
Absolutely right. But you still have people today promulgate that, say, well, hey, it's legal, so no, that's not how this works, right? But that is an influence of Americanism, right? So it's interesting that this wasn't really thought to be a heresy in more of what they call the formal way. It was more and more material heresy, but it's become much more prominent. And even, unfortunately, I think our faithful kind of fall into it. The question is, how bad of an Americanist are you? I think we all kind of suffer that in some way. And that's really what Leo XIII was trying to overcome, was like, no, we have to be faithful to what the teaching of Jesus is, not what whoever sits in the White House or on the Supreme Court or even in our mayor spot decides. because that's always, now we always had church and state separate, and that's okay, that's good to do, but these still our practicality needs to be guided by our morals. And if they're not, we can get out of whack and become very dysfunctional very quickly, which maybe one would argue we see that often today. So, church and state, there we go. That's how the church influenced the United States, and or at least interaction in the United States, and what the church teaches about these things. Any questions, comments, concerns, Harrison?
I think, and it's probably been like this through all mankind, but it's easy for a human being, and I'm guilty of it, to go a little bit off your barometer and say, well, that's okay. And if you keep on ticking one step, just a little bit towards one side or the other, you lose your balance.
Yeah.
And you don't correct yourself back up to morally straight.
Yeah.
And it's a slippery slope that many people don't see themselves. They do a gut check, but they use false information. When you do your own gut checks, you really have to look at the path you're laying down.
Oh, for sure.
And take the advice of people who are talking
for
to
sure.
you, whether that be, your friends or your boss or,
right.
or the reactions of people.
Yeah.
To give yourself an honest gut check, and
yeah.
Usually the people around you will give you a good.
You would hope, if you're surrounded by good people, you'd hope that, right? I mean, so it's or at least well-meaning people. Yeah, I mean, but yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of one of the struggles I think we fall into is that there's so much of a struggle of knowing what's opinion, what's fact, and we live in a society today that really upholds what we call relativism, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, kind of what you're saying there, John, is that, well, what's good for you may not be good for me, and so you go do you.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, but maybe the way I do things might be different. But if you want to go and if you're so maybe this is a good example. If you're a Catholic and you're baptized Catholic, and you won't get married in just the feast. Well, hey, maybe that's good for you. I wouldn't do that, but whatever. I think we see that a lot of times with our Catholic people when it comes to abortion. Well, I would never get abortion, but hey, maybe that's okay for you, right? I mean, well, the question you have to ask ourselves is, well, if that's not okay for you, why would it be okay for somebody else? And typically what it comes down to, I think, in the circumstances, right? Well, okay, so, if you're a Catholic and you want to get married just the peace, why are you doing that? Well, it's easier. Oh, that's probably true. It's easy to go down and get a piece of paper and get someone to say, yep, you're married, see you later. That's very true. But the question you want to ask yourself, is that really a marriage?
Is it real?
Is it real? Is it actually a marriage? Is it a bond of love that's sanctified by God?
Or is it a novelty?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt it would be much easier to do that. I'm not going to lie. That would be. When it comes to abortion. Okay, well, why would you say that you would never do it, but someone else might be okay? Well, maybe they're a teenager and they don't have any support and everything else. Like, okay, well, couldn't we provide that for them instead of killing the child? Wouldn't that be a better way to support both the mother and the child, right? It's certainly easier to get rid of the child. I'm not going to say it's not, but are our lives designed for ease and comfort? Are they designed for the cross, right? Now, an atheist probably wouldn't have that argument. They'd be like, yeah, easier. Let's go the easier route. Then you start to get more deeper discussion about, like, why would that be bad for them? Or even bad for you, right, if you were to do that, right? I think what gets overlooked in a lot of these issues is the after effect, especially when it comes to, I'm talking about abortion because I think that's most prevalent in our society as one of the scourges, but like, people don't see the pain of women and men after the effect. And one great grace I've been given is working with Abortion Healing Ministry.
Rachel Project?
Project Rachel, Rachel's Vineyard, but also recently a change in the Archdiocese because political. But we have a new program that just started last spring. It's going to be implemented. It's called Abortion Healing Ministry. Okay. And so it kind of takes a lot of Rachel's Vineyard and those kind of things, but it's also more localized and more direct towards the particular women, which is really nice. But you see these women that are wounded and these men that are wounded by this because you can stuff it down as long as you want, but eventually these
Facts
things
are
manifest in
facts.
some way.
Yeah.
They do. You know, it's no coincidence that people that suffer from abortion, they experience depression, anxiety, lack of intimacy, promiscuity, drug abuse. I mean, these are real things that happen to women and men from the effects of what they've done to their child. And so it's sad, but also incredibly beautiful that you see these people getting healed in these situations. It takes a lot of time for a lot of them. It does. But that's something that is kind of goes a little bit hidden in our society, the effects of what these things do. At times, it's very easy, yes, it is, but the impact that is almost lifelong, right? So I think the same thing we're seeing with like transgenderism. Not many people talk about people that are detransitioning, and there's a lot of those people that are now trying to detransition after they've had these surgeries and these things, and the amount of pain it causes. You know, for a time where if everything was just probably let go, it probably wouldn't fine. It probably would have desisted. But to make these decisions that are relatively quick that affect the rest of your life, it's sad.
The Europeans are recognizing that now, and they're stopping all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I hopefully we see that here. I think there's certain hospitals in place that are like now, like, oh, maybe this data has shown that it's not really working out the best we can. You know, I think even when we talk about, we talked about last month about people with same-sex attraction. One thing I didn't really discuss on camera was there's no studies. You know, a lot of the big question comes about when it comes to these things, these lifestyles is it nature or nurture? So in other words, is Lady Gaga right? Are we born this way, or is this something that was really developed over time? There are no studies out there at all to definitively say whether it is or isn't. The only study I ever saw, there was one in, there's a book called Living the Truth in Love. And there's a Catholic psychologist who'd had one study that was done. And what it showed was not conclusive, but there was an interesting commonality among those who experience same-sex attraction. Common is usually drug abuse or some sexual abuse. But also what was kind of very common was that those that were raised, let's say you have a young male that was raised by a group of women and never really had much male interaction, not a strong male interaction. He coined this term called the exotic becomes erotic. So once that male hits puberty and they start interacting with other males, whether it be in the locker room, whether it be in the gym, whatever it is, they start seeing these things or exposed to these things, that their brain chemistry starts changing and saying, oh, you have not been exposed to that. That is something you may want to engage with. Now, again, inconclusive. It's not, but there's been no follow-up studies of these things. And you kind of ask yourself, like, why? Wouldn't you want to know where this all comes from? Like, wouldn't you want to know how this develops, if it is developed, or is it like a genetic thing? And I think there's an interesting answer to that question, which I don't know. But the answer to that maybe nobody really wants to know. I don't know. But regardless, I think that's kind of what the Pope is kind of saying here, is that, we have to be in line with these teachings of Christ, and if we're not, we will see these things develop and go further, and we have. I think we've had plenty of proof of seeing that happen here in our country, where still we're the bastion of freedom, and I think we truly are. But I think that's also a lack of understanding what freedom truly is. Right? Are we free of indifference, or are we freedom for excellence? That's the way Thomas Aquinas puts it. So freedom from indifference is kind of this relativism. Hey, I may work for you, but your morality is kind of up to you. You get to make whatever you call it. Don't let it impede on me. Whereas Thomas Aquinas calls us to freedom for excellence, meaning we're called to the highest things. We call that magnanimity, the highest things, right? And so that's what we strive for. When we actually reach these goals and these virtues, that's when we're truly free. We don't need to turn to these illicit ways of gratification or self-reliance or whatever it may be, because we already have that in our Lord. But I think, yeah, we all don't do that perfectly. And I think that's kind of another thing too, is that we can very easily be called hypocrites because we don't live it. That's true. We're all sinners. We all need that grace. But also, that doesn't mean we can't try.
That's the whole point of being, you know,
Right.
you have to try every day. Know that you're accepted.
Yeah.
And your mistakes are paid for, but it doesn't mean you got it. You got to try.
That's right. You got it. I mean, we have to conform to that cross. That's what we're called to do. Great.
Interesting.
I think so. I always thought this is kind of an interesting topic when we talk about the church and state thing, because I don't think people realize the church has always upheld that.
In every civilization, they seem to have crossed that. You know, I mean, not just the United States, but way back when.
Well, and I think that gets into like another teaching we call of so the social teaching of the church talks about subsidiarity, right? So subsidiarity would be like if there's a problem, right? So we actually see that in our own government, right? So if there's a local issue that the local issue can't handle, the state has an obligation to step in. But subsidiary would dictate that you don't stay there permanently. You stay until the issue is resolved, and then you let the local level come back in and take over. And we see that in the church. So, you know, the Holy Father is, you know, he has, when it comes to faith and morals, he has final say. But every diocese is also governed by a metropolitan, right? So that if there's a problem in a particular diocese, let's say a bishop dies, well, who takes over? You know, typically a metropolitan would take over and say, okay, we're gonna run this until we get a new bishop, and then we'll get you up and running again. The problem at the metropolitan level, you come from the what they call the nuncio level, right? So we see that in the church, but that's where the state got it, was from the church, right? So yes, subsidiarity has always been kind of something upheld by the church, and that's kind of what we see in our own society, you know, is that everything should be run on the local level because they're more in line and understanding what needs to be done, right? Because I mean, the Pope doesn't know what's going on here in St. Louis for the most part. You know, he's got his own diocese to run.
Right.
But Archbishop Rosansky has a great responsibility to make sure that people here are being cared for spiritually, right? And as a pastor, has a great responsibility to care for the people that they're in charge of. So, but that's always been part of the church, right? So we see that, but also I think it's interesting to see that though in our society, in the secular. So I think we really look hard enough. You see the influence of the church in our society, but no one really recognizes it, right? Even secular law, the first kind of secular laws flowed from canon law, right? And so to your point, like when we see law throughout history that's happening, well, yeah, because when there's whenever there's sort of a vacuum, well, the most stable thing is going to come in, right? And if you have a king that gets dethroned and there's no one else to be the king, well, who else do we got? Well,
call the priest.
Yeah, bishop, why don't you come on in and run things until we get a new king, right? Yeah. So I mean that's so. Yeah, I mean again, the practice and the ideal has always been a little different, but that has always been the ideal. It's like we don't want to run things. Leave us alone. We just want to pray and bring you the Eucharist and bring you the sacraments and make sure you're taken care of spiritually. But from a secular thing, hey, you guys figure it out,
Render to Caesar.
Right, yeah, exactly, right, yeah. I mean, we see that in the gospel, right? So, yeah, Jesus is very wise. He's like, yeah, look.
He knew it from the beginning.
Let him run things. Now, no, I think in that too would be interesting is like, well, even Caesar is still under the authority of God. Sure, but not under the authority of the bishop. So we would, I mean, in some ways not. And so I think that's kind of the main thing. It's like we need to understand those clear swim lanes. And
so
understand
even
that.
those that there's a separation,
Mm-hmm.
the church still has an obligation to speak out against.
Of course,
correct.
of course,
The
yeah,
moral barometer.
yeah,
Okay.
right,
Okay.
yeah. So I mean, if it came down to if there's a law that's enacted that's totally immoral, the church, you have an obligation not to follow that law, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a moral dictate. That it's not just the church saying that. That comes from our natural law. That if there's a law that says you must rob from your neighbor, can't. That ain't gonna happen, right? And so the church has an obligation to say that is an unjust law and you should change that. Now, will that change? These days? Who knows?
We'll see.
Right.
But they have the obligation to speak out.
Of course. Of course. And I think she does. I think the big question, though, is anyone listening?
Yeah, some people turn off as soon as you get.
Well, I think that's also because a lot of people conflate political issues with moral issues, right? So if the church makes statements, which she does all the time, about, let's say, the death penalty, or, again, abortion, or euthanasia, or transgenderism, or immigration, even the environment, right? Most people turn off because, oh, it's a political issue, I don't want to worry about it. No, these are not political issues. These are issues of morality, of the moral order that we have a responsibility to uphold, right? And I think I might preach about this on Thursday, so I don't know if I'm gonna give too much away, but I don't know. But I think it's interesting that we look at the Declaration of Independence, and the way that Thomas Jefferson phrased it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think there's a reason he ordered it that way. Because I don't think you can have one without, you can't have liberty without life. You can't have pursuit of happiness without liberty. But those are all foundational on each other. And even like happiness, well, okay, we can maybe talk about what that actually is for each individual, or but I think we can say that what's happiness is happiness for all of us, right? Not just individuals. And ultimately found until we're found in God. But I think, which makes sense. So not everyone can have liberty unless everyone has life. I think that's pretty foundational, right?
Yeah.
And then not everyone can have happiness unless they have liberty. And we would even say dignity, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, it's very fascinating.
Smart guy.
I think so.
But he didn't rank them and say this one is more important.
He didn't. Well, I don't know. He didn't. But I mean, the way he put it, I mean.
But they're all tied together.
They are, but I mean, I don't know. I think there's a reason that he put those in line that way.
The pursuit.
Yeah. Not achievement, but the pursuit, right? Yeah, right. So I don't think you'd have one without the other previous, right? I mean, so that kind of makes sense. Well, very good. Well, thanks guys for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.